All right, well, welcome to our, what used to be our second Wednesday lecture series, which people have tried to make the Wednesday lecture series, and I think I am finally officially giving in. It is now the Wednesday lecture series. I don't think we've had a second Wednesday lecture in a long, long time. Well, welcome on behalf of the School of Urban Regional Planning, the Broward section of the APA, and of course, Florida Atlantic Planning Society. And thank you, Kara, for organizing everything so nicely. Yay. All right, so Dr. Prosperity just told me to make sure that everybody knows we have a tailgate on Sunday. Or see, I keep setting you guys on Sunday, so we're going to wonder when those on Saturday, right? The Owls are having their first home game, and the alumni are sponsoring our alumni student tailgate party. So please all be there. I think the game is at 4:30, so what time are we going to be there, David? 1 o'clock? 2 o'clock? 1? All right, 1 o'clock.
And sign in if you want to come to the tailgate, so that way we make sure we have food for you.
All right. All right, so in the last 2 years, you've had several events at the school. And all the school events looked at planning in Florida from a kind of retrospective, historical, contemporary kind of perspective. We had Secretary Pelham, we had Earl Starn, we had Senator Graham, we had Richard Rubino, we had a whole series of local planners that talked about their individual successes and failures sometimes in planning. What we haven't talked about at all is the future of planning. We talked about separate things. We talked about density and transit-oriented development. We even talked about climate change. We talked about green buildings. We never really asked ourselves, what is the big picture of planning in the future? We haven't really taken a comprehensive look at our communities. What is the future of our communities? What are the challenges that we are facing now? What are the challenges that we're going to be facing in the future? And are we going to be equipped to deal with the problems that we're going to be dealing with in the future? I think there's a couple of things that we haven't asked ourselves, some tough questions as planners. And I just came up with a couple. First question, and to me this is really the biggest question. And Jim is starting to laugh at me. It's like, oh my God, now we go. All right, so here's the first one. Here's one to ponder. Has reality outgrown planning as we currently practice it and as we currently teach it in the university? Are we equipped to handle the problems that we are facing in our communities today? Do we have the data? Do we have the right planning tools? Do we have the authority to make planning decisions? Do we have the right planning system? Do we have a vision? Now, I'm not sure that we're going to like the answer to all these questions. But I think what we're going to try to do in this lecture series is actually ask these questions about the future of planning in the next 20 years. So at the start of this series, I'm very pleased to introduce Charlie Siemon. Now, I'm sure that Charlie really doesn't need an introduction. He's a planning law consultant for over 30 years. Tremendous experience in a wide variety of land use matter. Has served clients throughout the entire United States and Puerto Rico. And some of the notable projects that you might have heard about are New Jersey Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan, of course, Meister Park. That's enough? All right, so I'll stop with all the other stuff. What I want to say, though, is over the past year or so, I've had lunch with Charlie on a number of occasions. And I have to say, I really have enjoyed those lunches. I really enjoy his insights into planning and the tough questions that he asks, not only about planning, but to me, mostly about planning education. So I hope he will give you the same kind of food for thought, and please join me in welcoming Charlie Siemon.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here to see some old friends, and I hope to make some new ones. I want to start off by giving you a couple of standard disclosures. My professional career really mirrors growth management in Florida. I was in Tallahassee graduate school in the late 60s during the first efforts at some environmental legislation, all of them unsuccessful. And I learned during those experiences that good science, I happened to be a graduate student, PhD student in biology, coastal ecology, and I quickly learned that good science doesn't translate into good public policy, and that lawyers really had the upper hand when it came to making law, particularly in the legislative. And that's how I came into this business. I went into the service for a couple of years. We had a little incident in Southeast Asia, and that particular history. And while I was in the service, I did a lot of reading, and I became convinced that the primary antidote to our problems is where we put things, and how we put things, and the way we put things. And if we did, we could preserve our environment. And it was no good to put scrubbers on smokestacks in industrial plants or in the wrong locations. I matriculated in September of 1972, and that year the legislature had just adopted what became Chapter 380 and the Florida Resources Act. And so here I was, a little bit older than most students, needing 3 or 4 jobs to keep I had by then 2 children, married with 2 children. And I had the great fortune to be hired to work on the First Elms Committee as a researcher and a member of the Florida Resources Environmental Analysis Council of the Geography Department, no, not Planning Department. Because the Geography Department, Land Planning Department hadn't figured out what was really coming yet at that time. And so I participated in research that led to the first Growth Management Act, the Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act of 1974. It didn't actually pass until 1975. And at my young and tender position was a very strong advocate for mandatory planning and the consistency relationship. And I wrote a technical memorandum on consistency with the comprehensive plan is essential to a rational system of land management. That led me to meet some wonderful people. Fred Wasserman, who was a consultant to Governor Askew on the matters that were before the legislature in 1973 and 4. That led me to Dick Babcock, who was the associate reporter on the American Law Institute's Model Land Development Code project. They gave me an opportunity to work on that, and then found me a job at the Conservation Foundation, and then back to Ross Hardy's in Chicago. And that has given me a really, I think, unique perspective for my home state. I grew up in West Palm Beach, so I'm sort of a local boy, fished the Florida Keys all my life. But I have had the opportunity to work for most of my adult life as a Chicago-based consultant in many states in the country, and work on programs over the generations. We did our first project in New Jersey.
On the bottom.
On the bottom?
Yeah.
It says on. Doesn't say mute. That works. Sorry. But our first project in New Jersey was in 1978 and 79. We did the comprehensive plan for the New Jersey Pine. Actually, my first project was the Hackensack Meadowlands, although I came along just at the tail end of that project and only had a small hand in it. But the New Jersey Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan in 78, 79. We did the State Development and Development Plan between 1987 and 1992. And then I recently completed the New Jersey Highlands Regional Master Plan in 2008. And so we've had an opportunity, while we've worked in Florida all these years, not just to look at Florida, to experience living what happens. And the New Jersey experience, I think, is a very interesting experience in a number of different ways. New Jersey was 200 years ahead of us in their growth curve. When we went to work in 1978, they were basically a built-out state. The lands that remained were some agricultural lands, about, 1.5 million acres probably, that were still in agricultural activity, and the others were state parks and matters, and the rest of it was the New Jersey Pinelands. And so they are confronted, before I started working there, most of the challenges I think we now face in South Florida. They had growth and development in prior centuries, and their challenge in the 70s was, how do you adaptively reuse the land we've already developed? How do we create livable cities in this landscape that was built in a significant amount in the same suburban style that we've had here in South Florida? So that's all a background. And so I'm not much of a cheerleader, frankly, when it comes to what we've done. We've had growth management now since 1975, fairly rigorous. We have the DRI Act.
I grew up in this region. I remember when there were only 500,000 of us in South Florida. I remember when my family's business in West Palm Beach had to close some of their stores in the summer because there weren't enough people here to keep it open. I remember when Ben-Hur came to South Florida and we had to go to Miami Beach because it was the only cinema screen large enough to handle it in South Florida. I remember those days, and I've watched how we have grown and had this unique perspective of living in Chicago, coming here frequently, having an office in Boca, and watched what we've done. And frankly, living in a city like Chicago, having opportunity to work in some of the other great cities of this country and to work in London for a period of time, I find what we've done, looking back at my age, I don't look back very proudly. I think that we are a region that has serious problems and serious challenges. I think the landscape we've created in the last 50 years is socially, culturally, environmentally, economically, and fiscally unsustainable. I think much of the problems we're having in this state, the economic problems, but the tax problems we had before the economy cratered, are all attributable to the lousy landscape we've created here. There are a few exceptions, but very few exceptions. We build a lot of buildings. This is one of them. But we don't build places. And when I go to New Jersey and come back to here, I can't compare. Even in cities that have been terribly driven by urban strife and problems, are really much more aggressive. And when they build a major center, a cultural arts center in Newark, it's a part of something. It isn't on the other side of the expressway, as happened in Dade County just recently. But my judgment is that history doesn't care what we've done in the last 50 years. I really believe we're going to be judged, those who are involved in it, and I won't be involved in it much longer. But those who are going to be judged on what we do in the next 50 years. Because we can take this landscape and translate it into something that has a balance of land uses, that shortens vehicle miles of travels, that provides alternative lifestyles in the form of things like Meisner Park or whatever your urban, quasi-urban flavor is. But we've got to stop what we've been doing. We've got to start creating communities of place. That's a phrase that we used in the title for the New Jersey Development and Redevelopment Plan, and I think we need to stop talking about comprehensive plans and we need to talk about community redevelopment. And community development, we're not developing projects, we need to develop communities, and we need to redevelop to make those communities real places. I believe that we have the physical and financial capability, if we have the leadership and the vision, to transform this landscape into, frankly, instead of being one of the laggards, to be one of the leaders in the world. Our climate, our latitude, our position, particularly with Latin America, are all things that we could take advantage of. But we have a lot of work to do. We're one of the largest metropolitan areas in this nation, and we have no real urban form of function. It really just doesn't operate. Even where we have Metro Rail, you get off the station and there's no sense of place there. There's no there. Dallas, for God's sakes, has done a better job than we have. I remember Eastward Ho? Remember? Well, what we really got was Westward Low. Westward low sprawling density that we just can't sustain. We've talked about compact urban centers since the Elms Committee, the first Elms Committee, but yet density is still a four-letter word. I mean, there are cities in this region that still max density at 20 units to the acre. You can't build a unit at 20 units to the acre that a real person who really works for a living lives in. So we've got a lot of really difficult challenges above us. It's amazing to me. I gave a talk at the APA convention in Las Vegas a few years ago. I got myself in real trouble. I was asked to speak about planning for 2100. And I said I preferred to focus on 2010 right now, but I'd go ahead and pay tribute to them. And then I said, we have a giant set of factors and forces we need to examine. And I said, I don't think APA is up to it. I don't think our profession is capable. I think there's no reason to be optimistic. And I said, and there's a simple reason for that. Tony Downs wrote a book in 1974 called The Cost of Sprawl, and he told us exactly what would happen if we did what we did in South Florida. And we did it anyway. We knew what we were doing. We pretended it was not true.
knowing all the time it was. As a profession, we just sat, we punched those tickets and drew those plans and complied with the 9J5 rules, et cetera. And the results are exactly predictable. Go back and read it. I recently reread the guts of Cost of Sprawl. It's in typewriter font. It's strange reading something. But it's amazing. The summary components of it told us what was going to happen. And we did it anyway. And so when I look to 2010, when I look at where we stand today, it's hard for me to be optimistic about 2100, let alone 2025 or whatever we're doing. Everybody has a new year. We have so many issues. I love it. I was told when I first started working here, my first downtown project, I think it was in Sarasota, transit will never work in South Florida. Well, the reality is it worked when I was a child. I rode the bus in downtown West Palm Beach from just south of Forest Hill Boulevard. It was a perfectly delightful thing to do. And it was something that at 12 my parents would actually let me do. Other than that, I wasn't going to get to go downtown and have lunch with my grandfather during the summer. But the reality is we made it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course it won't work in a suburban sprawling landscape where you have densities of 2 units per 4 acres or something like that on a net basis. And so we have, since 1974, worked very studiously to make sure the transit doesn't work. And to get it, we're going to have to turn it around. We're not going to do it like New Jersey did, which is provide the transit to the densities that were there. We're going to have to put transit first in order to attract people to now come live in compact urban centers, which means somebody is going to have to change the existing paradigm. Somebody's going to have to invest in something new. There are other issues that I pick out. I was reflecting on the comprehensive plan, and I got out 3 or 4 comprehensive plans in communities that I work with regularly. And I also got out their land development code. And as I sat there and tried to compare them and understand them and see what I do every day working with property owners or neighborhood groups or with those local governments. And the truth is, the comprehensive plan has very little to do with what we do every day. When it gets pulled out is when somebody opposes something and they find out, say, suggest it doesn't comply with those points. But it doesn't inform us, it doesn't guide us. I go to planners in community after community and I look on their desk, I look consciously on their desk, and there is no comprehensive plan on their desk, it's on a shelf. I went, I'll say it here, to the city of Vero Beach. I was asked to go look at a piece of property for a client, and I was driving through going to Jacksonville. And so I stopped and I went in, and I realized that in the pack of stuff they'd given me, there was no comprehensive plan. So I went to the planning office and asked at the counter, could I borrow a plan just to look at it for a moment? They couldn't find one. What I realize is we have allowed this land resource management planning, that's what I like to call it, that we do, to be captured by land development regulations. The plan is really nothing, as it has turned out to be, but a setup for zoning regulations, or what we call now land development regulations. And in my view, it's got to be much more if it's really going to achieve what we have always anticipated that it could do for us. And I think that the emphasis on regulation, the emphasis on what the law allows, is really missing the point, because what we really need to be doing is promoting what we want, which is good, not worrying about what is bad, which is usually what color is the building, how tall is the building, what are the setbacks of the building, things that really don't matter in the real world. We once did an exercise with a classic local ordinance. I told someone we were doing a new zoning code for that I bet I could take 50% of the code out and that they'd have everything they need. And this was before we started rewriting a new code. So I went through the exercise, I took it all out and gave them each a copy lid. And you know well, it turned out it really didn't matter. You know, whether the fence was 4 feet in the R1 district, 4.5 feet in the R3 district, it was 4 feet in the R5 district, really doesn't make much of a difference. Another part of our problem is, and this is, I think, fundamental to where we go forward, is that our Growth Management Act, as it has evolved over the years, it has been compiled onto and piled onto and compounded with more and more regulations, is that it's dependent on an adversarial process. It pits people against each other. And I like to say that communities that are fighting over their future usually don't have one, and I really think it's true. Things are too difficult, and I think if I could do one single thing to how we plan in South Florida, it would be to eliminate the adversarial process
and make it a collaborative process. We've done that in a couple of codes in this state, and it's had tremendous benefit to the communities. I think it's easy to do, but you got to get out of a mindset. We have to start talking about we, and not me, and not us, and not I. It's we, because if we don't literally stand together in planning, we're not going to succeed, in my judgment. Concurrency, I believe, is the worst thing we've ever done. I think concurrency, I argue against it. I argue against anything that tries to reduce the relationships that we all deal with every day to quantitative matters. It simply is not true. We're human beings, and we relate to our environment. I was trained as an ecologist. I would like to see what we all do be called human ecology, because that's what it really is. We ought to be systems ecologists. We ought not to be planners. But the reality is that concurrency is easy in a political environment, because you don't have to take risks. You don't have to make decisions. You don't have to make judgments. You don't have to worry whether it's gray, it's all black and white. And I believe that what concurrency has been is the second triumph of the city functional over the city beautiful. And that it has been a modern tragedy. It's had unintended consequences in so many ways in South Florida. It has promoted sprawl. We know clients that don't come downtown because it's more expensive, it's more difficult. You can't get concurrency. You've got to get a technical waiver. You've got to get a TCA. You've got to run through all the hoops to do those compact urban centers somebody wants to do. The city of Boca Raton paid $560,000 to get a downtown DRI approved so that they wouldn't be subject to the Growth Management Act of 1985, because they knew they couldn't possibly meet any of the concurrency standards. That's where that effort, which ultimately led to Meisner Park, came from. I was trying to track back something that I'd heard, and it's not exactly what I thought it was, but the Vitruvius's prescription in his great book, De Architectura, said that a structure, I thought it was a place, but it was a structure, must exhibit three qualities of firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. That is, it must be strong or durable, useful, and beautiful. This battle between the city beautiful and the city functional, which gave us the depressing cities of between 1925 and 1955, has been repeated here, because we really had to throw beauty out because it was all about concurrency. And it's all about concurrency in another way that's a plague on our house. We have allowed ourselves over the last 30 or 40 years to believe that there's a free lunch in land use planning and management. And that free lunch is exacting from developers money, because these greedy developers are making all this money, and if we get a piece of it, we cannot raise taxes. We can provide some good and service that we would otherwise do. Well, the problem with that is that too many local governments have become complicit in sprawl. They want sprawl because they're going to get more revenues. They become a part of the problem. But the real problem is it affects what developers do, the kind of products they produce. I'll go back to, if I have to pay $25,000 per unit for a residential unit, I'm not building a 900 square foot apartment that a young couple can start out in. I can't afford to. It's simply not economic. I have $50,000 for land costs, $75,000, multiply that times 5, and I'm out of anybody's potential reach. And so what people, you can't build up. Every $25,000 that's lumped on that unit says you can't build up. That's the way you can make alternative forms of housing available. One of the things we don't do good in South Florida is match what we produce as real estate products with what our people need, because of that economic reality that I've just described to you. Broward County, there was some information published a couple of years ago about the new jobs that are going to be generated in the next 10 years. We can't produce housing for one of them. The economics of building units in Broward County, because of density regulations, because of impact fees, because of other exaction and extraction. So it's fine for a commodity business if we want to hang a big tax on a commodity, which is what our economy's been, buying land, turning it into a commodity and selling it, not for its intrinsic value as shelter, but because you can make a profit selling it. 30% of our housing in many areas goes to seasonal housing. one of our most precious resources are all these things, these assets. We have water and roads and all that stuff, and we devote it to 30% of the seasonal. When people who work, the hospital, the nursing people can't find housing. In the Florida Keys, there are 3 nurses living in one house trailer, divided up into 3 sections. And so concurrency is also remarkable because of what it says about us. The most important thing to our state is that people be able to drive around anywhere as they want to go, anytime they want to go, and not be inconvenienced. Our level of service standard is 75% of capacity. And that's more important than safe and decent housing. A safe and decent project producing safe and decent housing for university students or for young families or for single household elderly can't get a permit because we depend upon growth to pay impact fees to build our roads. We don't assume the responsibility of investing in our community. Boca Raton, to their credit, invested about $27 million in downtown Boca Raton in 1987 to about 1991. The net increase in additional revenues today per year from that investment is $9.2 million every year. We need to transform how we plan as a basis for how we invest. Local governments have got to stop depending upon growth and development at any cost to generate the fees they need, and they need to become entrepreneurs to invest in assets and infrastructure and things that will generate future development that serves the community and generates revenues that make that community healthier. And that's something that is absolutely off the screen in anything we do. I find it remarkable looking back that we would establish a standard, given the reality that we've known all along that sprawl was going to come back to bite us one of these days. A standard of what's acceptable when we'll issue that permit for that affordable housing project at 75% of capacity. Who can afford to buy 100% and then only use 75% of it? I mean, what conceivable? And it's not life safety. You know, you can get the fire equipment through at 100% capacity. That's what it represents. It's convenience. We have allowed the reality of our existence to ignore the facts of our lives. Civic architecture. I wanted to address the subject of civic architecture. I've decided it comes in South Florida in several flavors. 4 lanes, 6 lanes, 8 lanes, and 10 lanes. I think that's the sum and substance of our civic architecture. Somehow, we lost the thread. We transferred the responsibility for civic architecture to developers who are out trying to make a profit. And we look to them to build things for us. The battle over what is now the Central Plaza in Meisner Park was epic. It's too wide. It'll never operate as a retail street. It wasn't ever intended to be a retail street. It was intended to be an urban plaza, a park, a place of refuge. That's what cities used to do, cities and other institutions. Our economy. This period of time, which I never expected I would live through at my age, has been disastrous. And we've not yet seen anything. My personal view is the underemployment which is coming, that is the inability of people who were gainfully employed and probably overemployed, made more money than their actual service to them in some objective economic world. Those jobs aren't coming back. And we usually say in South Florida we've got about 30% more commercial retail stores than we really need. We've been able to survive by living on those credit cards, et cetera. But I think we're going to see a really serious challenge in South Florida. And as I look around at the jobs, and we in Boca Raton and in the Keys, we're looking for jobs all of a sudden. And we've never had to do that before. And there are very few opportunities. I mean, most all of the jobs we have circulate dollars. We have a Ponzi scheme. It really is a Ponzi scheme. Somebody buys some raw land, they build some homes, they go buy new cars, fancy, it circles all the way around. Now that development
didn't pay its own way. It paid impact fees, but it created a liability that's going to come back in 20 and 30 years and bankrupt the local government who's got to deal with it. But in the meantime, those dollars circled. There was no value created beyond what was created by that home. Everything else is just passing the dollars around. And I think our economy in South Florida, as I look at it, is really more akin to some of the classic resource extraction economies. It reminds me of the copper mining in Montana. At one time, the Anaconda Copper was the 4th largest economic enterprise in the world that wasn't government-owned in 1916. And then they ran out of easy-to-mine copper, and guess what? They went out of business. And the rainforest, the Mayans, read Collapse. How many of you all have read Collapse? Jerry Diamond wrote a very hard read, but it's about how societies choose to survive or fail. First reading on my planning curriculum would be to read Jerry Diamond's. Now, it's not all gospel, but you ought to understand that Florida's been doing that. We've been converting raw land into commodities, selling it handsomely. We got more furniture stores than any place in the world per square foot, and they have no future. Try to go out and sell a furniture chain right now. I happen to have a very good friend shared the board membership at the Boca Raton Community Hospital, and it's been on the market for 4 years. Nobody's even looked at it. Nobody's interested because it's not coming back because we're out of land. There's a few acres down in southwest Miami. There are a few, but it's marginal. If you take the acreage of Broward, Palm Beach, and Dade County, the amount of land that's available, unless we decide that we're going to really make Pahokee and Clewiston and Belglade the urban center of South Florida, which some people are actually talking about in Palm Beach County, we're basically done in at least the coastal components of these counties. And we need, I think, to start figuring out what are we going to do? We don't create value in many traditional ways. The city of Fort Lauderdale, interestingly, has an economy. Their maritime services, their maritime commerce is really an amazing economy. It generates value, it generates goods, it generates services, and the most important thing is it imports dollars from outside the region, and outside the state, and outside the nation. They bring them here to Fort Lauderdale. That's one of the bright lights. But try to think of the other things that we do in South Florida, that have jobs, that create value, that we're not passing money back and forth, fooling ourselves that we're actually successful. And there are very few things we have. And one of them is that we're not using the intellectual capability to generate ideas that can be translated into new jobs and create dollars that come in and support. And so when I get to my bit about what we ought to be doing, I don't understand how you can have a comprehensive plan that doesn't have a central element, which is your economic, your sustainable economy. How can you figure out what land use you need unless you know what your economy is going to be and what kind of employment you're going to have? Where's the education element? I'll come back to my prescription for what we need to be doing. Our land management system doesn't work in South Florida. And the notion that look out the door, look at the window, look at the fabric, get on Google, however you want to look at this landscape, it's not uniform. There's all kinds of sprawl. We have every possible kind in the area. But everything that I do as a professional is out of the box, doesn't fit into anybody's regulations. I haven't done a project in the city of Boca Raton that hadn't required a substantial, some sort of deviation, an amendment to the code, an amendment to the plan. I mean, it just doesn't fit in because when you're working in the built environment, you have to fit things, you have to change things, and what's next door makes all the difference of whether it's contextual, whether it's compatible. And so the notion of the traditional fixed uniform set of regulations that we started out with in Euclid all those many years ago just doesn't work. And the other is everything is in somebody's backyard. And so if people don't want it in their backyard and their political institutions respond to that, then we're in a world of hurt. And we are in a world of hurt in lots of ways. I think we're at a crossroads, and some of you have heard this before. It's really irrelevant, but I just love it. Woody Allen said, "More than any time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray that we have the wisdom to choose correctly." I think our
repercussions are not quite as dramatic as that, but I really do believe that now is the time, with this setback in the economy, the opportunity to reset the system, to reconfigure. I think Senate Bill 360, with all its warts and all its whatever as they are, whatever your position about it is, to the extent that it creates an opening, an opportunity to rethink how we do business, particularly in the urbanized portion of the state, I think is an opportunity that won't come around many times more in our future. So I believe if we're going to make this next 50 years valuable, we need to take advantage of this opportunity. In Collapse, Jared Diamond says that, and points out that people knew what they were doing. I mean, they chose to fail. He says that, and he describes in painful detail the Easter Island society. It emerged and thrived, fueled by forests which had evolved over the centuries. Unfortunately, increasing success accelerated the demand for wood as building materials, as fuel, and quickly outstripped the capacity to grow new forests. Worse still, the forests were the habitat of important food sources and critical to the creation and maintenance of soil cover, which washed away when the forest disappeared, leaving only the great Easter Island figure. There were early warning signals. It didn't happen overnight. It happened over a century. And they stood there and watched it happen. One of the reviews, which I love, says, the lesson of collapse is that societies, as often as not, aren't murdered. They commit suicide. They slit their wrists, and then, in the course of many decades, stand by and passively watch themselves lead to death. Diamond chronicles 4 stages of failure. Exuberant growth, competition, etc., leading to recognition of a problem and then denial, failure to act to address it. And as I lay where we are in South Florida against Diamond's 4 stages, I think we're at stage 3 already. And I think we're at the point where we're in denial, and if we don't act, we are not acting, and it will soon be too late. The warning signs are everywhere. There was an article in Time magazine. How many of you all read that last year? Title of the article, front cover article, is Florida the Sunset State? The language of it was vicious. The quick quote, which I love, greetings from Florida where the winters are great. Otherwise, there's trouble in paradise. We're facing our worst real estate meltdown since the Depression. We've got a water crisis, an insurance crisis, an environmental crisis, a budget crisis to go with our housing crisis. We're first in the nation in mortgage fraud, second in foreclosures, last in high school graduation rate. Our consumer confidence just hit an all-time low, and our icons are in trouble. So much for the Chamber of Commerce. New York Times this past month in August, late August, said after a century of growth, the tide turns in Florida. Not a very flattering. I have a handout. I didn't hand out my handouts. Clark Stevens, who was a graduate of this program, sent me an email the other day and pointing out that you'll see this as the red spots in 2020 are the areas around the world that are in water stress, projected to be in water stress. You'll see that we're in red, and if you look at the map where the other red spots are, you'll see the great deserts of several continents, and you won't see many coastal tropical environments for the rainy season. And the reason for that is that we prefer flood control management to water management. One of the largest users of our water is flood control. It's what we discharge into the Atlantic Ocean and into the Gulf of Mexico every day. South Florida Sun Sentinel, 22nd of September. South Florida incomes are flat or declining for the past 5 years. That's not just the bubble burst. That's just the economic. It's the underlying, the downturn in the economy. It's the underlying fundamentals of our jobs, of our economy, that we've got to deal with. Senate Bill 360, I don't know whether it's a curse or a blessing. We'll find out, I guess. Hometown democracy.
hometown democracy, I think to put the future of any community at individual votes about individual projects or individual plan amendments or individual anything is insanity. But, the truth is, the reason hometown democracy is here is because our system isn't working. It doesn't have. You talk to the average citizen, they don't know what I do for a living. They don't understand how these things happen. All they know is that something changes and they don't like it, or they didn't expect it, didn't understand it was coming. And so it's been easy pickings. And for whatever it's worth, a lot of my professional peers are all saying, it's not going to pass, don't worry, it's not going to pass. And anybody who wants to buy a future ticket on that, I'll be making book after this meeting because I'm betting big time that when it gets down to it, unless we've done something significant, that election will pass, and then I think I might get my wish because I frankly think the outcome of the bill, we will get rid of that program and start anew with a new label that doesn't fit the constitutional provision. But we have serious problems. My good friend Pogo, my view is we've met the enemy and he is us. I mean, we all own. I remember riding somewhere, meeting John DeGrove many years ago at a conference over here in some hotel, and I asked everybody to stand up, raise their hand who had come in another, shared a car with somebody. And there were about 300 people in it. Of that, about 5 people raised their hands, which was crazy because I couldn't figure out where the 6th person was. But the reality is we are the problem, and we all are. I found a wonderful quote, I just love it. The city can be friendly to people or it can be friendly to cars. It can't be friendly to both. And it's just a reality. The automobile owns our public realm. How much have I run over already? 6:20. It sort of reminds me, I had this notion that came to me last night. I sort of feel like it reminds me of Tom Hanks in Apollo 13. And after the explosion, he gets on the radio and he says, Houston, we have a problem. It's one of the marvelous understatements of all time. And I was going to use it as a parody as to where we are as a South Floridians and what we're facing in the future. And, it's not as bad. I mean, they were at risk of just going off into deep space and being lost and destroying our space program. And then I thought about it. At least they had a ground crew. Mission control with a lot of highly skilled technicians, a good organization working together, capable of making tough choices and decisions, life and death decisions to move things on. And what we're talking about fixing here is in the hands of institutions of populist politicians. Can you imagine? We have this problem with Apollo 13. City Council will now come to order. We've had a motion by the director. We've had a mission. The mission control director would like us to make a decision. Are we going to swing them around the moon and bring them back, or are we going to take the chance of reversing the engines and trying to fire back? And I can hear. Is there a motion? Mr. Mayor, I'd like to suggest that we study this a little further. I'd like to send it back to staff, and we can take it up at the next meeting. I don't know what your experience is, but that's what I see. So I'm looking at the landscape. I get to drive it. Jim gets to drive it every week. Every time I make it, I get more and more depressed. It's just not something to be proud of. And when I think about my children and my grandchildren, it even makes me more anxious. And so what I think we need is a new planning construct. And I really do mean a new planning construct. I think that the notion of regulating land use as the predominant focus is really the tail wagging the dog. That we need to really talk about community. And the foundation of the community is a sustainable economy, whether it's agrarian, whether it's hunter-gatherer, whatever it is. And that's what we need to decide. What can we be and what must we be to be economically and socially and culturally successful. It's pretty hard to ask somebody to preserve the alligator when they live in the middle of a swamp and the alligator is sitting on their door every day. The first element
is not the educational element. The first element is information. Our citizens don't know what's happening. They simply don't understand. Everybody I can talk to one-on-one and spend a half an hour with, I can get them to get it. But it takes that. We had a little experience in Boca Raton. You know, growth necessarily is the cause of traffic congestion. Well, we had a situation in Boca Raton, fairly stable community. A lot of people worked in the traditional eastern part. They stayed in their jobs a long time. They bought houses when they bought them in the 1960s. They were $70,000. They're now worth $350,000 or $400,000. When they retire, the new hire doesn't get paid what the retiree with 25 years in gets paid. It's a new job. That retiree is going to sell that house for everything he can get. And that retiree's house, before he retired, was about a mile from his place of employment, either at FAU or at City Hall or some other place. And so each trip going to and from work was about, let's say, 2 miles. 2 trips, 4 miles a day. That's how many vehicle miles that job and that home produced. Now, in Boca Raton, we've always had this phenomenon. We don't grow. I mean, there's a lot of concern that Boca's growing, too big of buildings, et cetera. But if you look at the incremental value, if everything that has been built since I've been involved in Boca since 1986 on an active basis, relatively active basis, and if we built 15,000 units in that time, 10,000 units in that time, it's remarkable. And, you know, it's less than 20% of what's out there generating traffic every day. It's a marginal impact, but yet our traffic keeps going up. And so I thought, you know, it's people traveling through, people in Deerfield going to Delray, people in Delray going to Deerfield, et cetera, et cetera. We did a traffic study to confirm the downtown DRI's numbers, et cetera, and it wasn't the case. You couldn't find those trips coming from somewhere else. So we did an affordable housing study for the Chamber of Commerce, and we discovered something by accident. We got some really great data, probably data we weren't authorized to have, but about where people live and when people move, when a job changes, where does the new person live? And what we discovered is happening is that trip is that home, that job has to be taken by somebody who's now starting out. And so where do they go? On average, when they don't locate in the city, they find housing 19 miles away, just the geography of where we're located. But once you make a decision not to commute, then you start looking at the cheapest housing, lowest cost housing, most bang for the buck, best community you want to live in. Of course, that's not the community you work in, which has its own social contributions. We were stunned by that. And then we realized, well, who buys that house? Well, the lawyers, young lawyers that work in downtown Fort Lauderdale, as it turns out, or in downtown West Palm Beach, can't afford the housing in their communities, but they can afford the housing in Boca. So what happens is the employee, instead of having 2 vehicle miles of travel every day, generates 38 vehicle miles of travel. And the house generates another 38 as the new owner commutes to Fort Lauderdale and back. And so where we once had 4 vehicle miles of travel, we now have 76 vehicle miles of travel. Not one new job, not one new house. And what's happened in this landscape is that we have set ourselves up for those kinds of misunderstood, unanticipated circumstances. So the first element has got to be to compile this planning initiative, whatever it is and however it comes about, needs to get information. There's a world of information out there. It's bewildering. You all deal with it. Try to research anything. Use the internet. Try to make sense of it. It's a research project. And people don't have the patience or the capability to do that out in the community who are making the real decisions. And that information needs to be synthesized and digested, and then, this is the critical point in my judgment, it needs to be packaged and presented in a meaningful way to every level of our community, from the city manager to the elected official, in different bundles in different ways. You know, the ULI had a wonderful thing, 10 myths about traffic congestion. Put out about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it really was just 10 simple points. It really made a world of difference for people if you were able to use that. But we need to have everything from the most complex for the technicians and the professionals, all the way down to the simple sound bites for neighbors and for elected officials. And we need to educate the citizens who live in this region, who want to stay in this region, who want to invest in this region, on what we need, what the realities are, and what we need to do. Because if we can't do that, there's no hope. Because they've got to be willing to participate in making the choices to go a different direction. And if they don't understand it, if they can't embrace it, they're not going to do it. And that, I believe, is a reality. I think that it is remarkable to me, and I've been in this business for 35 years. I have tried with others on at least 5 different occasions to get funding for a major documentary on land use. And it still doesn't exist anywhere in this country. But yet it touches everybody, everywhere. And the ignorance which is shown in public hearing after public hearing about basic principles that you all understand and learn about, but they can't comprehend, is a remarkable phenomenon. Someone who is associated with this university, Ruben asked you one of my favorite quotes. A leader is someone who cares enough to tell the people not merely what they want to hear, but what they need to know. The first element or the first leg of a new planning construct is to tell the people the information they need to know. Because right now, because they don't understand it, you see articles every day about people, the congestion, I just don't understand it, so I'm moving to Georgia. I'm moving to North Carolina. It's really happening, and that's the first thing. The second is to rescope the scope of planning on a systems basis. This is an old saw, and it's not been a particularly successful saw, but we have a regional economy. We have a greater than regional water supply system. We have a mobility network that extends over multiple counties and I don't know how many municipalities. And to try to manage those things from individual perspectives is just nuts. It makes no sense. No business would manage its affairs that way. Have 55 different businesses all in the same company in this conglomerate, and they don't talk to each other, and they don't share infrastructure, and they don't share capital. They don't share anything. That's what our municipalities and local governments do. There are very few experiences reaching back. The quiet revolution in land use control has been very, very successful. But I would draw on the experience of New Jersey for an example of how we could go. The New Jersey State Development and Redevelopment Plan had a process that mimicked our consistency requirements, that the local plan be in compliance with Rule 9J5 and consistent with the state plan and the regional plan. But they went about it differently. First, when the draft plan came out, it went through a process called cross-acceptance. And cross-acceptance was an organized process where on a county-by-county basis, not a municipality-by-municipality basis, the state and the county negotiated resolutions to conflicts between the state plan and county plans. And they were open, active dialogues. And the local governments, to have their voice, had to sit at the table with the county speaking for them formally in the process. And there were 82 amendments to the state plan made as a result of the negotiations through this process called cross-acceptance. It was not called do it my way. And the difference, it's not a panacea, but the difference in the plan that came out and the difference in the relationships, there were a number of municipalities that during the planning process, which took much longer than we thought, modified their plans to come into conformity with the state plan, which is then called communities in place. But against the recommendation of another consultant working for the Office of State Planning at that time, I persuaded the state not to add a land use regulatory and strict compliance requirement, that their regulations had to be consistent with the state plan. And my argument was that you can manage all your affairs without stepping on local government by simply allocating state resources on a priority basis according to consistency of the local plan with the state plan. And if you decide who gets priority on sewer systems, who gets priority on road improvements, you won't have to worry about who has control over land use regulations or what densities or whatnot. You'll allocate your funds. And we got, although it was not in the legislature, we persuaded the governor to write an executive order that required all state agencies to be in compliance with state law. I believe we could create a construct for the greater region that would provide a funnel, not unlike the old MPOs, but much more structured and much more diverse in terms of its support, that would promote what has to happen, which is the shared responsibility for resources that really extend far beyond local. It's not going to be easy, and I can't choose my remarks here delicately enough. But one of the biggest challenges we're going to face to any change is going to be us. We are all so entrenched in the system to say concurrency isn't serving our purpose well. The Secretary of the Department of Community Affairs is saying traffic concurrency needs to be gotten out of the urban areas since he came back to the office. But it's being fought, it's being resisted in so many, because we're all entrenched in our own realities. And so there's got to be, out of the profession, change. Change needs to be affirmatively embraced. I think that the elements of planning, we need to focus on not just the economy we need, but the workforce we need. And education isn't about how many school seats we have. It's what kind of skills are we teaching people? Are we preparing them to participate in that economy? And I don't know how, if you don't know what your economy is, and if you don't have the workforce who's trained and skilled to participate in it, how you can even worry? Why do you worry about land use? Mobility. We got to stop talking about transit. We need to start talking about mobility, how people live, and we also need to say that there are trade-offs. There are inconveniences. If you want to live in the suburbs, go knock yourself out. But don't complain about the traffic congestion. You know, I'm amazed by people who stand up in public hearings and say, I was in the road the other day and the congestion was intolerable. How can it be? If it wasn't tolerable, you wouldn't have been there. The reality is it's all in what you expect. Those same people, my father did it. He'd go to New York City, was in West Palm Beach all his life. He'd go to New York City and rent a car. How much sense does that make? I mean, you put yourself through it, but it's what we expect. Safe and decent, affordable housing. We've got to get out of this thing of one size fits all. You know, we build the same home for everybody. And we've done that because that's the only way we can get through the system. We build these big trap projects out here. We don't do things at fine grain. But look at our population. Look at our demographics. 35% of our households in South Florida have 1 and 2 people. And the average home we produce for them is only almost 1,900 square feet. What are we doing? And it's got a yard around it that we can't afford to water. And by the way, they can't afford to cut it either or have somebody else cut it for it. But we need to focus on housing as shelter, not as a commodity. And I would even advocate that ultimately we need to distinguish between those two. That housing, which is not shelter, which is an investment, which is a tourism project, which is a seasonal housing, ought to be in a separate category. And so that and one of the arguments we always get is, well, we would support more density if we were getting housing for our nurses in our community, or our students in our community, or our parents in our community, but, you know, that's just going to be higher condominiums. Well, let's discriminate between them. Let's recognize what we're doing. And let's get the size down. A big part of the affordability crisis is just the size of housing. Somebody go back and get the data, look at 1950, look at 1960, look at 1970, look at the affordability curve, and you'll find out there's a direct correlation. Aligned population housing with population. And people don't live in the same housing in real worlds all through their life in this country. You start off in a small house, you move into a larger house. When you get older, you move back into a smaller house. You get places where you have reduced mobility. We need to create those places. We build one size fits all. Lennar puts it somewhere, and there it is. Communities of place, they're easy to do. Go to New Jersey, drive around. Go to California, drive around. You'll see what they're like. They come in all sizes and flavors, but they all have common elements. The public feels welcome. There's a public realm, and the car is subordinate to the human being. And you're just not going to do it. We've had Meisner Park open now 18 years. There are no pedestrian crosswalk signs anywhere in the park. We've never had a pedestrian hit. They have equal dignity by the design of the place. The car and the vehicle have equal dignity, and so they watch out for each other. I believe we need a center strategy. That's the only way I know how to balance land uses, bring jobs and opportunities, non-residential, closer to great places with lots of residential, and vice versa. And I think to do that in any effective and efficient way, given the lag we have on transit, it's got to be in some sort of polycentric, compact urban form. And one of the handouts is Ebenezer Howard's slumless and smokeless community. And what you're really looking at is what we need to do, except that in his conception, much of the green were going to be farms between those polycentric centers. We've already turned them into suburbs. But if we were able to lay these centers down on it, you can see how the organization will balance jobs and provide greater efficiency in terms of transit. I guess I won't spend any more of your time, but I want to hit the punchline. I don't think you're going to see any of these changes coming out of our institutions of governance, our local governments, our regional governments, our state legislature. I just don't think it will come there. And I don't think you're going to see it coming from special interest groups, the Sierra Club or whoever. Hometown democracy has just stopped. We don't know what the right merry-go-round is, but we know we don't like the one we've got. Let's stop it. And frankly, I think while we'll hear a lot of words of repentance from the private sector, I don't think you're going to see it there. And the great institutions of learning in history have been the origins of ideas and thought and leadership. In community after community around the world for centuries and centuries, the millennium, the great ideas and the great leadership has come from the academic and intellectual integrity of university systems. And I believe, I'm not saying this university particularly, but I believe if we have a hope, the idea for new planning construct will come out, if it's going to come out of any university, will come out of a university of higher learning. And if it doesn't, I don't believe that we will succeed in meeting the challenges of the future. I believe that it's possible. I believe that there'll be a probable initiative somewhere because I think the consequences are so great. But I have no confidence whatsoever. I do think that the initiative must do one thing that's not been done before, and that's to create a collaboration with the private sector, not just developers, but the marine services industry in Fort Lauderdale, the high-tech medical tech and biotech in North Palm Beach County, and every other fledgling business who generates jobs, who operate businesses. I think that and engaging them in the process because they need that support is the best hope we have for developing and promoting a new construct. But we won't get there if we don't have the information to explain to them that it's worth their time and worth their energy to participate in it. And so and to spread the idea, I have no doubt a good university can create out of its intellectual horsepower a model that will work. But to sell it to the people is going to require that first leg, that body of information that answers the question why, and answers it in a compelling fashion. And maybe it's in TV, maybe it's in a book, maybe it's in brochures, maybe it's all of those things. But that's the challenge, I believe, of